Hi, I'm Divij. I will quickly just start this off by introducing what this project is, what its vision was, and just kind of a note of gratefulness and appreciation to everybody who's been able to join, particularly the artists and the contributors here. So we're here to discuss a project called Reclaiming AI Futures, which was the inception of which was while I was working as a tech policy fellow with the Mozilla Foundation, and this project has been supported by the Mozilla Foundation. I noticed that a lot of the conversations we have are kind of, they project these visions of these technological futures as inevitable, right? Like that artificial intelligence is going to inevitably be the end all. It's going to change our lives, it's going to revolutionize our lives in these very particular manners, or within this very particular framework. And it becomes very difficult when critiquing these to actually step out of that lens, to step out of that inevitable imaginary of these technocentric visions and utopias of our future, which are almost always guided by big tech or big government and this kind of centralizing, totalizing visions of what artificial intelligence might look like. And so I thought a great way to do that, to challenge those critiques, maybe outside of like traditional tech policy thinking, is to imagine different futures for artificial intelligence, right? Different futures for our technological selves, our technologically led societies. And specifically, so that was one idea, and kind of prompted by a really great line from a scholar I really admire called Ruha Benjamin, who says that like if we want to, while we dismantle the systems or the futures that we don't want, we also need to reimagine and recreate the kinds of futures that we don't want, to broadly paraphrase. And so I set about trying to get this word out to artists and activists and writers who can build such futures for us, who can kind of try to imagine something, create something that's different from what's being fed to us constantly about this inevitability of artificial intelligence. And also I wanted this critique to focus on Indian society particularly, because first of all, there's not a lot of conversation about the peculiarities of technology and artificial intelligence within India. And owing to that, there's also not a lot of kind of critical thinking about what it means, where it comes from, what it implies for our identities and our agencies. And as these projects came in, and all of the artists, thankfully, have been able to join, and I'm so grateful for all of you for contributing, but also kind of being a part of this endeavor, or rather being this endeavor, and I'm just a small part of it. As these came in, I saw two main themes emerging from this idea of reclaiming AI futures. The first, and both of these kind of relate to questions of identity and agency, right? They question how artificial intelligence and data-based technologies reframe our identities. How they show like distorted versions of ourselves, or different mirrors to ourselves. And they also kind of tend to get you to question what forms of agency you might have in these technocentric visions of artificial intelligence, right? So what can you demand from AI? Is it something that's limiting your capacities and your agency? Or is it really something that you can demand more from, right? Is it something that can help you, that can be like a technological tool for improvement of individual selves or society? And so the exhibition kind of takes you through these two related but kind of distinct frames of thought about how identities are being changed in our interactions with technology, and how agency is being redefined as well, and kind of how can we grapple with these, how can we think of new ways to imagine these futures. And that's what this is all about. It's about kind of finding deeper critiques, more meaningful critiques of kind of this saturated artificial intelligence, the kind of things that are fed to us already, and to then reimagine what these features, what a future that we might want could look like. I will very quickly, so I'll share the link for the project. It's hosted in 2 ways. And also thank you so much to Pratish Raman as well as Design Beku, who kind of Design Beku helped with the broader project under which this is hosted called AI Observatory. And Pratish Raman helped develop the web page on which these exhibitions are hosted. And the link which I've just sent to you is, sorry, I have not sent it to everyone yet. Yeah. So I just sent everybody a link to where this project is hosted, where this exhibition is hosted, and it's hosted in 2 ways. The first is kind of this immersive environment of Mozilla Hubs, which is supposed to be like a virtual reality environment. So it emulates a traditional gallery or an exhibition. You can walk through it, click on the projects, interact with them as you might in a gallery or a museum exhibition, something like that. The other is a more kind of easily accessible low bandwidth version, which is just the projects hosted on the web page itself. You can click through, learn more about the artists and their inspirations behind this work, and also see all of the different artworks as hosted on the web page itself. So that's all from me. And I hope, so the rest of this time is going to be taken up by the artists themselves, kind of talking about their projects, talking about the inspirations, what guided them here, why they decided to, how they think that this kind of reclaims AI futures and what it means for them. And at the end, we'll have a short kind of discussion amongst ourselves, amongst everybody who's attending here. And yeah, enjoy. And I'm going to turn my note off. We'll start off with Diana.
Thanks, Tej, for that wonderful introduction. I hope everyone can hear me all right. Great. Thanks for having me here, and thanks everyone who really contributed so much to this project, both Divij, Mozilla Foundation, and as well as Design Beku, Pratyush, who played such a big part in the website. I really want to thank all of them. My project under Reclaiming AI Futures is called I Am AI version 2.3. And it's actually a game. So it's something you can play with your friends, or you can play in your office. It's basically a magical game that combines elements of role playing and strategy. It uses a narrative driven by shuffling and picking the cards, and players move around the city of Parallelverse Bengaluru as 4 different characters, which you can pick, and they interact and converse with each other through shuffling and drawing of cards. And it is a game which challenges players to examine their assumptions, both about artificial intelligence and about revolution, while collaborating through processes of journaling, self-reflection, discussion, and strategic decision-making, along with some critical guidance from the goddesses of chance. So for me, the inspiration for this game was largely my witchcraft practice and divination tools like tarot and cartomancy. And when I was thinking of artificial intelligence and how much currently a lot of it is geared towards taking huge amounts of data in and producing randomized kind of outputs by looking at patterns and enabling prediction. And when I was thinking about predictive aspect of it, I was particularly really enthralled by what other modes of predictive tools kind of existed before AI as an alternative to AI. And that kind of got me thinking about something like cartomancy and tarot cards. And that's why this game is kind of designed to think through AI as a different system of modeling and prediction, which actually involves collaborative friendships with the people you play with, and how then we can think of a different kind of future, both in our technological lives and otherwise. And I think like I just really would be curious about people's experiences as they're playing the game, and what kind of questions which turn up as like their prompts in the game. So you can kind of just enjoy doing that talking to people about what we mean by AI. I would like to talk about 2 or 3 brief provocations, which kind of emerged from this game, at least for me. One was really about thinking about the supply chain of AI, because right now we talk a lot about the harmful consequences of AI and things like bias and discrimination, which are, of course, like really problematic and really important to talk about. But with this game, I also wanted to shift the focus a little bit to thinking about how do we produce AI and what kind of exploitations take place within the production lines of AI. And there it becomes really important to think about data as well, and how data is used to produce AI, and what are the modes of generating data as well, and who is exploited in those modes. And there are both human and non-human actors like involved in these supply chains of AI, which we don't account for, because I think like normally when technology or digital technology, we tend to think virtual, and there's so little like material rootedness, which is given into these dominant discourses about AI. So this game is also, in its setting, it's kind of directed to allow people to think a bit more about the material embeddedness of AI and what kind of labor exploitation and land exploitations are really underlying AI production. The other thing I wanted to talk about is the other provocation basically was the idea of who produces knowledge. This is this kind of like a more broader theme. So I wanted to think about the practice of prediction through machine learning algorithms and AI models versus prediction through more traditional, magical, and even so-called superstitious models like tarot. And in doing this, I was intrigued by the underlying ideas and differences between the two systems. So which way of knowledge production about the world has authority? Because AI, in its essence, is a mode of generating knowledge about the world. It orients us in a particular way to seeing the world. And so does tarot, but there are very different modes of doing that. And I wanted to kind of compare and contrast, which mode of production of knowledge gets authority, which does not get authority, and what are the often colonial, misogynist, and anti-witch histories behind it, the kind of power relations and struggles which we see in the early modern period, and how they are kind of replicated into our current technological practices and the ways of knowledge production through those practices. So that was kind of the second like idea I wanted to bring in, I think, which the game tries to bring up as you play it. And the third is just the idea of revolution and what it means to you, what it means to us. When we talk about the AI revolution, who is that revolution for? And who reaps the benefits of it, and who is the sacrifice on the altar of the revolution. So basically, these are the 3 provocations with which I bring the game to you. I will be very excited if you guys play it, and let me know how you like it, and to hear from you and for your questions. And thank you. I'll wrap up there. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Diana. And yeah, for everybody who's also watching, if you want to kind of click through the works and the projects that are being presented while you're listening, if that helps you, feel free to do that, and kind of it might help you prompt some questions towards the end of the discussion as well. So the next presenter is Vishal Kumarasamy. Vishal, are you online?
Hey, I'm here.
Hi, great. Take it over.
Thanks, Divij. And thanks to Dan for going before me. Hi, my name is Vishal Kumaraswamy. I'm a Bangalore-based artist and curator. I work across text, film, sound, performance, and computational arts. Within my practice, I move between sort of gestural and conversational research, some theoretical references, news media, and cast realities. Over the last 3 years, I've been actively engaged in the development of a critical, sort of somewhat speculative pedagogical framework. It's called subaltern futurism. It's meant to be a container for artistic research practice and sort of this tech education of contextualized subaltern communities. The work I'm presenting to you today, I'm just going to share my screen and show you the works. I'm just going to give you a small introduction before that. It's titled "Your Data Set Won't Let Me Thrive, Your Data Set Must Die." The works, they are a pair of video essays. They seek to sort of counter popular mythologies of AI technology and the conversation about AI really. And they engage in a kind of literary study of the poems of the Black Beat poet Bob Kaufman and the Kannada Dalit poet Dr. Siddhalingaya, obviously in translation, intersecting with large language models, basically the data sets inside of text-based neural networks like GPT-2 and GPT-3. The visual layers of the work, and you'll see this a little bit, they contain sort of animations of an image-based neural network that is generating generic brown faces, video textures from creative programming, and the text itself that you see is a hybrid composition of the poet's and the neural network's words. The works are an interpretation of the nature of human-machine relationships today, and one that is accelerated by this sort of false promise of neutrality in AI. There's a lot of research that demonstrates how social biases that arise in non-diverse programming and development environments lead to that transference, right? The encoding of those biases into these algorithms that kind of dictate our lives. And the resultant sort of algorithmic injustices, particularly on marginalized subaltern bodies and identities, is merely a continuation of sort of this hegemonic social and state power structures. In the neural network's inability to sort of gauge nuance, context, or prevalent sort of socio-political realities, a kind of counter mythology emerges, one that seeks to extract the potential for harm embedded in these algorithms and present it for the fallacy it is. I'm just going to show you the work, and that will be the end of sort of my presentation, and then we can pick it up later if you want to have any conversations with me afterwards. Right. You should be able to see this. If you can't hear it, please let me know. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Vishal. Yeah, that was really hard hitting and really fascinating. Shrishti, would you like to take the floor?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Divij, for hosting me and the entire Center for Internet and Society team. I hope everyone can hear me okay. There are like sirens going off in the background, and I'm sorry about that. But yeah, so before I get into what I've created for this project, I quickly want to go through my background because that's exactly why what I did came into being. But essentially, at the time that I was starting my work on my project, which is called This Scene May Contain, I was also just stepping into this whole like big bad world of tech and AI and machine learning and automated decision making, and all of it was very fascinating to me. So I thought that this was the perfect opportunity to kind of merge what I was really excited to learn about this field with what I was kind of already working in, which was at that time writing, media, and design. So I come from a advertising background, and because of that, and I come from a, I guess, in general, a media studies background where we were kind of made to think about a lot. We were not only analyzing, say, all kinds of mass media from advertisements to television to film and radio, but we were also made to confront the different and the many, many ways in which it influences society, right? I mean, of course, everybody knows that media and culture influence society, and art imitates life, but life also imitates art. So what we see kind of essentially becomes a part of the many versions of ourselves that we perform, you could say, in a kind of in a very subliminal way. It influences our behaviors. And so when we were asked to create provocations around how AI could impact just modern Indian society, I thought that, okay, let's look at how maybe AI could change how we think about Bollywood, because it is one of the most foremost influences of behavior and thought in Indian society. And as we know, Bollywood isn't perfect, right? It's got like its own criticisms, and fairly so. There are a range of issues and social issues associated with Bollywood themes that have been constantly discussed about in mainstream media, but that conversation still remains restricted. Not, I wouldn't say restricted, but at least it hasn't really kind of expanded into a larger circle of discussion. It remains in a lot of ways just a institution of privilege that certain groups in urban settings talk about, like all the themes that they're exploring, because what we see kind of translates very differently depending on the way we've grown up and the different groups that we've grown up in around the country. And so around the same time that I was working on this project, there was this huge uproar about OTT censorship in India, where we were looking at this entire new way of viewing being taken up and falling under the purview of the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. And at that time, people were made to think about how this completely new way of projecting new content that was never previously allowed to be projected on the big screen would now also be censored in a very similar way that Bollywood movies was. So, and at that point, I remember in one of the articles that I was reading about when I was doing my research, that one of the ministers or the spokesperson was talking about how they could be using automated decision making to kind of weed out content that they thought was problematic from their point of view to be shown to Indian audiences far and wide. So I thought, okay, wait a second. If they are going to be using AI and machine learning systems and very bold and very ambitiously to censor content that people watch on OTT platforms, which at that point was a hope for many content creators to finally be the space where they can freely talk about many, many themes that wasn't previously tackled in mainstream cinema. Why couldn't we use the same tool in a future where Bollywood movies could then be scrutinized in a similar manner, but instead of censoring it in a way that takes away its freedom of speech, we look at it as this critical piece that is then broken down depending on all the issues that it has. So AI would essentially be picking out, or at least reporting on, the different problematic content that Bollywood movies have. So in line with that, I sort of the many big categories in which Bollywood has in many ways misrepresented its audiences, whether it's or stereotyped its subject matter, whether it's racism or whether it's sexism, casteism. There's like an array of isms that it's been, I guess, focused on just performing in its many ways. But I will quickly share my screen and take you through my process and what I've invariably ended up doing. But okay. Can everyone see my screen okay? I think. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, so you can see I created a series of 3 collage-like explorations where I basically imagined this future where, in a very similar setting to how streaming platforms today are telling us a lot of information in real time. You know, when we watch something, it's very similar to how an X-ray works on, say, Amazon Prime Video, right? It's like reporting on content that you're viewing in real time while you're viewing it. And in a very similar way, this imagined AI would expose content that was problematic in the movies that you were watching. So for instance, if you look at the piece that I've created on misogyny, I've kind of mocked up or referenced and alluded to our viewing screen, which is now the source of viewing for many people. I guess, especially in pandemic times, it was relevant because our streaming platforms were the only way we were consuming content. We weren't going to movie theaters anymore. And I kind of took that and I reimagined how the screen would look like in a very abstract, speculative way, and put several different isms into place. So you can see the timestamp that appears on top is this kind of alludes to whatever time at which certain content is being played. And then the monospace font is kind of a nod to how the coded font or the AI would report on the problematic content that was being displayed at that point. And several different, I imagined how it would be reported to people who were just watching it and come from absolutely no, I guess, background on what exactly was the issue with what they were watching. So when we talk about misogyny, for instance, you would have like explicit displays of misogyny, like ways in which women were being obviously sexualized on screen. And there were also like a subcategory of subtle observations where it wouldn't be very obvious, but it was alluding to, say, certain fat-phobic content on screen. And you basically break down what you were watching in the many different ways in which it was being problematic. So you kind of have a reference to how AI could be used to do the opposite of what AI was told to be, was proposed to be doing if OTT was being censored. But I also, at that point, was very into collage exploration. So I thought it was really interesting to see this kind of vintage imagery, which was sourced from public domain platforms, and put it against this theme of future techno, against themes of futuristic techno themes, because I guess I have to use this word, but the juxtaposition essentially was very, very important to me to kind of bring together these vintage elements alongside these futuristic elements. So and this is a series that I continue on as I practice what I'm doing right now, which is working in computational art form and creating and working off of my own practice in digital humanities, because I'm currently pursuing my master's in design technology at Parsons. So this is something that feeds into what I'm doing right now. And I'm also actually kind of working on algorithmic processing to, in a very similar way, sift through data that can hopefully take the speculative work and actually make it something real one day. And that's why, and in a lot of ways, this project would have been the start of this much longer project that I'm hoping to work on. So yeah, exciting. And I think I remember, Diane, even you mentioned this, but one of the biggest provocations that I came across, and as I have been getting to know more and more about how AI works, is about how we talk about how AI can truly and objectively sift through all this data and report to you in a way that it doesn't in any way make certain issues seem more or less prevalent, or make certain themes basically the reportage was always imagined to be objective, that it would take away any human bias. But obviously we know that that's not what's happening, that it's basically reinforcing the biases of the people who poured into it. So as we go into, and in relation to my work, I imagine how we could codify AI to do, like, expose problematic content when the person who would be creating the AI itself cannot truly be fully objective when it comes to sifting through this data. So that's like one of the biggest provocations that I take away from this. And I continue to hope, I guess, that there could be like a solution that works for everyone someday. But yeah, that was my presentation.
Thanks, Shrishti. And yeah, it's really fascinating to see kind of how your artistic practice develops and the fact that you're trying to go towards, like, reach towards the speculative and try to build it. That's fascinating.
Thank you.
Great. So Daksha, Simran, and Karthik. Sorry, sir.
Hi, good evening. Am I audible? Thank you, Divij. Thank you, my fellow artists. It's so exciting to be here. Thank you, Center for Internet Society, for arranging this for us, and we're very excited to be presenting our work here. Our art piece is called Algo Leela, and we're a team of 3. Karthik, Simran, and I. Simran is a user experience designer working at Microsoft Studio 91. I am a designer working on improving education in rural schools of Khargone, Madhya Pradesh, working with Azim Premji Foundation as an associate. And Karthik is a freelance visual designer, illustrator, and animator. We'll go into presenting our work now.
Yeah, but a little about the work before we start. We're going to be showing you what we've created as a narrative of GIFs, but a little bit about it before we start. So this happened last year when Daksha and I were about to complete our thesis, and we worked under this umbrella called Deconstructing Algorithms for the Common. And we, like, straight up diving into it, we understood that it wasn't just about considering one piece of the puzzle. It always meant we had to consider the developers' limitations to storage, to dealing with pools and oceans of data, and then also to ensure a robust system at play. It was also about design trying to sort of include what a user needs. But at the end of the day, there is always a user narrative that decides whether something's working or not. And so to be able to put it all together in one such narrative, Algo Leela was created to bring a speculative inquiry into what we think the future of AI could be. Daksha, over to you.
So our art piece is called Algo Leela.
Algorithm ki Leela, algorithm hi jaane.
The tricks of an algorithm can only be known to an algorithm. Leela means play. Often it's used while describing divine acts and speculating that there might be a bigger and grander meaning to it that us commons cannot understand. So hence the name.
This project is our effort to imagine how users perceive their interactions with automated decision-making systems. We created Algo Leela as an attempt to include development, design, and user considerations in a single crafted narrative in local languages, starting with Hindi.
Ed Finn, in his book, What Algorithms Want, says, the cathedral is a structure where many of the most important bits are invisible, hidden, and unspoken. When comparing algorithms to the cathedral, it is an entity that cannot be questioned, which works in definite, precise, planned, and divine ways.
This was also something that we referred to as a resource while doing our thesis. And this is the book that majorly inspired this piece of art. Scene one.
The Cathedral of Computation.
Algorithm ki leela, algorithm hi jaane. Jo vah bole, hum wahi maane.
The tricks of an algorithm can only be known to an algorithm. We just follow and do as it says.
We're going to want to keep like a 3-4 second pause just for you guys to view the artwork. Then I'll be proceeding. Just to not have it as awkward silence. Scene 2, the panic behind progress. जो कुछ भी बोला, क्या समझ बोला है वो, जाने क्या देखता, सुनता और समझता है वो.
Whatever algorithm says and instructs me to do, why does it do so? Who knows what it sees, hears, and makes of it? Scene 3, future of digital interactions.
काश तुम समझ पाते अपना काम, क्या काश तुम समझा पाते अपना काम, क्या समझी तुमने मेरी परेशानी और क्यों कर ढूंढा यही इलाज.
I wish it could explain to me what it does, how it understands my problems, and tell me why it shows the solutions that it does.
So the idea is, what happens when an algorithm becomes your boss or instructor? In India, this can be seen in almost all scenarios of digital interactions, but especially in the case of digital labor.
This strange employer-employee relationship, facilitated by an algorithm, has a population of stakeholders who probably have held a smartphone for the first time and are economically vulnerable.
The ways of an algorithm are often understood in a piecemeal manner. What if the algorithms that instruct users could explain themselves? What if users were looked upon as more than employees, but as first-time learners?
Learning to understand the ways of working of the algorithms that they are interacting with and its impact. What if algorithms could explain themselves as teachers, helpers, or as friends?
We imagine the future with explainable AI, a movement that seeks to explain the decisions made by an AI system. We wish to create pathways for explanations that are truly human-centered and empathetic.
To develop activists out of users who can question and seek answers to their questions about digital interactions that puzzle them, hence moving beyond the seduction of user interface design. What if we can create expectations that look at users as learners and align with various pedagogical frameworks? We imagine a future that is just, accountable, and equitable.
We'd be open to any questions you guys may have, probably after all the presentations. Over to you, Divij.
Thank you so much. I particularly, that was a really great presentation, firstly, and I really enjoy kind of the reframing of this black box metaphor into critiquing the kind of divinity that we ascribe to it, moving forward to it becoming a teacher and a friend. That's really interesting. Yeah, thanks a lot. And Brinda, the floor is yours.
Hi, I'm Brinda. This is really exciting that you guys, I have followed the Algo Leela project, because that kind of sort of sets the stage for what I am going to be presenting with my work as well, right? I think I may have, it was also very interesting that their project was based in Hindi and English. I think I may have one or more than one perspective to offer here with my piece for this project. But before I begin with my piece in this project, which is a speculative fictional narrative story, I'd like to share something like an anecdote or something that just happened on Sunday. I'm a researcher, and this is something that a respondent shared with me during an interview that I just did on Sunday, right? This is someone who lives in rural Karnataka, and a trans person living in rural Karnataka, transgender person living in rural Karnataka. And this person shared their challenges, or the challenges faced by transgender persons in general in rural Karnataka in changing their identification documents, the gender and name on their identification documents to reflect their self-identified name and gender, right? And this is extremely crucial in order to be able to enter into data systems for transgender persons. And this is so important again when we're talking about algorithms, AI, to be present in data systems, right? He spoke about how the application forms are only available and in Hindi or English, and most in the transgender community usually have low level of literacy because of all kinds of discrimination and stigma that they faced growing up. They dropped out of school and all of that. So they need to take the help from the person at the data center, your computer centers. In rural Karnataka, they still go only there to be able to access computers because all of them don't have smart devices, etc. Right? And they're dependent on this person at that center to be able to help them fill up these forms as well. And when these forms are in English or Hindi, the data center person knows only Kannada and is not able to read the form or help them. So this is among some of the kinds of different kinds of struggles that transgender persons go through to procure their identification documents, using which they enter data systems. And when I say enter data systems, I'm not even talking about just welfare systems, right? I'm talking about to be able to access any sort of service. Even if you go, I'm being very, very optimistic here when I say e-commerce websites, because those are things that are actually quite inaccessible to transgender persons, I would say, because gender is not, is very understood, very in the binary. Okay. Even to procure something from e-commerce website, you need to ultimately have a bank account, and transgender persons struggle with opening a bank account because banks need ID proof, one, in your self-identified gender and preferred name, and also address proof. Most trans people find it very difficult to get rental agreements with their name on because people don't want to say that we have rented our houses to transgender persons. So this is also here also we're talking about how so much of offline reality is missed out when we're designing these digital systems as well. Right? Now over to my piece that I wrote for this project. Word is a speculative fictional narrative story that I have written for the zine based on my work as a researcher, a peer supporter working with the LGBTIQA plus community. Why a story and why not something else using technology, right? I work in the technology sector, why not? As a researcher, I work at the intersection of human rights, identities, and technology. And as an advocacy professional and trainer, using both Tamil and English for my work, I basically wanted to translate these complex technologies into relatable realities for trans people and for gender and sexual minorities, basically all the communities that I work with. From the example that I just gave you all, it clearly does not, technology right now is not capturing their reality sufficiently. It's not, I was just mentioning it to a colleague even today. In technology and technology sector, working in the sector also, people tend to talk down to these minorities about how they should be looking at technology and how it is, they don't step down to their level to even listen to them and understand what their realities are even, right? And that's also why bringing together all these different aspects, I wanted to know how do I then take these non-human concepts like say AI technology and explain it to them in human terms, right? More specifically in terms of understanding gender. I thought the easiest way to do this would be to write a speculative fictional story, kindling the imagination of the reader. I consciously did not want to use technology because they're actually not accessible to the people whose stories I'm basing my story on, right? I hope to actually take this story as an example to the communities that I work with on the field and explain the impact of technology and data to them on their lives. And that's also the reason why this is a simple text-based story. I also have a Tamil translation of this story along with the English text, because that I will get to in a bit as well, because of the word for non-binary genders not being actually present in many Indian languages. also, including, how we understand it, non-binary, how we understand also its, um, there's a lot of politics to that there as well. I don't know if I will have the time to get into that aspect here, but in this story, I have attempted to question AI's imagination and its impact on our understanding of gender in the future, right? The premise for this story comes from the lack of a word to describe the experience of being non-binary in many Indian languages. Non-binary is an English phrase. So how will someone who does not know English identify their gender experience as being non-binary? How does this translate to automated decision-making systems when the design of technology aping the real world continues to view gender in the binary of male and female? These questions were only the starting point for the story. In this story, I've explored the experience of understanding one's gender when there are no words to understand it in one's native tongue, right? Especially for a non-English speaker, and how that experience is captured and translated by AI. Set in 2000s, this story titled Word is a grandparent's last letter to their grandchild coming out as being transgender, non-binary, at a point when there is possibly no understanding about anyone who identifies as transgender. The story traces the experience of someone assigned female sex at birth and raised as a woman who later identifies themselves as being non-binary. It is also a queer love story. Wish we had more of those to understand queer realities. That said, this speculative fiction does not reflect all possible realities. However, based on my work as a researcher, I have attempted to explore the impact of AI on gender, AI on gender and language, among other intersections in this story. This story, like I mentioned, is available in English, and I've also had it translated as well. I am looking to also have it translated in other languages if possible, because, like I said, so many of the Indian languages don't have a word for non-binary gender or even technology, right? To understand technology very clearly. Uh, we are having to borrow from English, and that has its own limitation with respect to access and understanding. This also has so much to do with gender expression and how that is also captured by machines as well as human beings, right? Like, what is a transgender person supposed to look like, sound like? Can someone who looks and sounds like me, for instance, be non-binary? Or do we box even transgender, non-binary identities in very binary boxes? For instance, like me, a person who's assigned female at birth, is it like, do we have expectations of such a person to only look masculine in their gender expression? Can a person who is assigned female at birth look feminine and say my gender identity is non-binary? How does AI and machine learning capture these nuances when even human beings don't, right? I've explored some of these ideas in this story by situating the central characters as Tamil speakers. More importantly, non-English and non-Hindi speakers, like, for instance, the trans persons from rural Karnataka that I spoke about in the beginning. It's I'm not reading my story itself here right now, but this is essentially the context for it, and I would be happy to answer more questions. And I felt the need to also give the example about this rural Karnataka one and explain a little bit about trans realities, also because in the last event, someone in the audience had mentioned that, we should be looking at reclaiming, these words in Indian languages representing transgender realities. I thought that it was very privileged. If anyone working on transgender rights hears about it, it's very privileged point of view and very disconnected from the reality, because anyone working on transgender rights, we are all working on actually looking at more inclusion in systems. It should be in the design of the system and not make people from the community to actually be reclaiming these words to become included. right? I mean, it's on the state and systems, designers to think about including everyone's reality. Why is it on the marginalized to think about going and explaining themselves to everyone all the time? And I think that needs to really shift in the technology policy space as well, policy and legal space as well, to stop shifting the onus on the minority communities to come and explain their realities to be included. That's also my attempt in this fictional story. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Brinda. And yeah, I urge you all to kind of look at the story on which is in part of the exhibition. And I really like kind of, how it helps us think about the limitations of language, of normativity in code, source code, kind of language as pseudocode, which gets translated into so many of the rules that we then have to live by. And it's a really fascinating story, and the translation as well, which is really fascinating and important work. So thanks so much for that. Zai and Spandan. Thanks, Spandan. And I think it's really fascinating that kind of this project particularly, I think it explores, the organizational, institutional features of what we call artificial intelligence. A lot of times we kind of end up hyper focusing on the algorithm, the tech, the source code as kind of like the fetishized object of our attention, and ignoring like the ecosystem around it, which of course, like, how we organize around these technologies is equally important, if not more important, than the technologies that we're actually focusing on. So thanks so much for that. And Paul, are you online?
Yep, I am.
Floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay. I'm gonna share the same presentation that I've done in the previous event, but I have like a bunch of annotations. Some of the things have at least changed since the last time we've spoken. Let me just share screen. Yep. Well, there you go. Okay. Hi, my name is Paul. I was part of the team that Divij kind of worked with as Design Beku to kind of put up the bits and pieces that is the AI Observatory. The presentation is titled Maps, Territories, Learning, Knowing, which is my way of using the research that was part of this entire process and interpreting it through illustrations, because sometimes words have their own limits, especially if English language is primarily, as we've heard from other folks as well, the way we've spoken about automated decision-making systems. I stepped into this project on a tangent because there were other projects that kind of preceded my approach to this. So the presentation kind of puts it across as a timeline. The one additional link that I might kind of put after this presentation is kind of where this journey is at right now. Things will be clearer. The website has kind of the text that I'm mostly going to speak over. It has some of the links of the previous projects as well. As a part of the ongoing mapping, the actors that you see are an extension of a project that started off with the Center for Internet and Society called Revisualizing Cybersecurity. It was supposed to be a media handbook. As it exists today, it is a manifestation of this weird intermingling of corporate and state interests around platforms, citizen or user participation. This participation kind of become hotspots for data extraction. Some folks call it surveillance capitalism. Some folks have other terms for it. Each of these interpretations come with its own baggages. For me, I am a researcher who studies online behavior and primarily internet memes. From the presentations that I've seen today, it is really, really humbling to be part of a growing culture of trying to interpret and make at least a little more of this conversation accessible, be it across language or be it through visual or language metaphors. And this is a problem that I think continued into the other project as well. So Padmini and I were kind of working on this EPW article where we were looking at the personal data protection bill, and we kind of going through the myriad voices that were articulating what this bill was. It wasn't, how ambiguous it was. Padmini kind of wrote up this large text document that was a summary of our research. And at the end of it, there's this huge burning problem that the text was in English. The inability to kind of make it accessible was something that we were kind of up against. At which point we were planning on making either a game or a comic because of funds and other constraints. We kind of stuck to a speculative comic. So we were exploring the relationships from the previous project in Dad and his Invisibility Mundo. And we were looking at the rift between legality and justice when it comes to legislation around data and privacy. So this central character of the state kind of having power over systems that digitize information, especially digitization as a representation of its citizens, as well as then kind of being further enabled by automated decision-making systems to kind of slice and dice what its citizens are up to and doing as a way of governance, to put it lightly. And so at the end of the previous presentation, the same presentation, based on a conversation that we were having, we started calling, Big Brother is a metaphor that we kind of have thanks to George Orwell. Saying Big Brother all over India actually doesn't get you anywhere into this conversation much, unless you are with people who've read Orwell across. From the previous project, we started using this like aggregation of state systems, and we called him the nation, which is kind of a joke that is part of the CIS project footnotes. But after kind of going through this entire presentation, we started talking about it. And what we realized was, along with Big Brother, we have corporate organizations who kind of are predecessors of this slice and dice digitization, making sense of the people as users and not necessarily as citizens. And so along with Big Brother, the nation, we started talking about Gig Brother as well, which is part of the next project. So at the previous project, I thought that things were kind of over, like the nation had kind of come to its natural conclusion. As a meme, it was dead. But then Padmini and Divij comes up with this request of kind of looking at or articulating automated decision-making systems, which is kind of what most of the illustrations are right now. So the illustrations in this narrative are an attempt to create visual language for phenomena around ADMS and the various actors engaged in structuring, running, subversion, and through it, the ones exploited through it. The mapping or the extension of the previous projects develops different relationships between the nation. As I said, Big Brother is also Gig Brother, and the people they want to know, because the nation wants to know constantly, keeping in mind the unfolding nature of ADMS and machine learning models. There is a lot of conversation of ADMS around the world, but both through text, that is research heavy, as well as other formats, the conversation in India feels very limited, and there needs to be more people. There needs to be a wider age group of people kind of engaging with this conversation, and soon. Otherwise, there is a tendency to be kind of divided into this binary of tech utopia and tech dystopia. Whereas when it comes to it, it is a very inept system that has technology as one part of it. Historically, it is not the only part of it. So there are biases and problems that are already part of it. So the CCTV ones leaning heavily towards private or corporate interests represented without the crown. The ones with crowns are state bodies, often constituted by an electoral process, directly or indirectly. So for it to be mimetic so that other people can take it at some point or the other, the idea was to kind of codify the visual language a bit. So the color red is used in this project to indicate something that manifests tangibility or materiality. So subjects, citizens of the state, infrastructure that allows for participation or interaction. These are real things. They are present in the physical world. The color blue is usually an indicator of aggregated data and data sets that have been compressed, processed, either through manual moderation, paperwork, and supervised or unsupervised learning models. And then there is like this mix of red, blue, and yellow that indicates the extraction of behavior that has been quantified in one or more ways, often under the label of raw data. So while drawing these, the rawness kind of points more towards a metaphor for vegetables and uncookedness, as opposed to referring to data as oil, which is kind of revolving around this sense of data being crude or data being pure or data being good data. Green is usually the indicator of learned abstraction or choice, probability-based kind of abstraction. That is what the machine kind of does and what people colloquially refer to as artificial intelligence. It is part of a learning model that recognizes human behaviors with its own glitches through translation and matchmaking, depending on the task that is being automated. So typologies for images for facial recognition or numbers in text for welfare, license plate IDing is part of the repository that which is kind of accumulated under the AI observatory. So the illustrations are kind of working as graffiti or as icons, whichever you would like to think of it. Through the entire project, what what I wanted to stick by, there's only one black box in the scheme of the illustration, and it refers only to the environment in which either the program is written or where it's parsed. Because this is a slightly speculative or mythical landscape of the nations, it is easier to assume transparency to something that is non-anthropomorphized, which is the automated decision-making system. Instead of allowing the persistence of this metaphor of dystopian black boxes, which originally comes from a mnemonic that was used in how flowcharts are read. So it's trying to push human agency from hope into despair, and I didn't want to kind of continue with that meme. So for this project and for the previous ones as well, it cannot be the consequence of mapping complex things. The nation is the only CCTV'd anthropomorph, and as they are a result of human agency directed one way or subverted in another, it makes sense to kind of ground these illustrations or this genre of interpreting decision-making systems in this peculiar way. the mapping underscores the importance of the territory. So this is kind of going back to Borges's interpretation of the exactitude of science. And kind of drawing from that metaphor, the learning model underscores the importance of knowing contextually the lived experiences of people. That can only be categorized and generalized to a limit. And as much as systems like UIDAI, Aadhaar, and the other ADMS-based systems like to think that linked data can be synonymous to unique identity. Linked data is not the map of a person's unique identity. And that's kind of where this journey comes to a conclusion. During the process of that journey, this weird meme kind of happened towards the end, and which was kind enough to push out the irony of it as well, where the machine is finally trying to recognize the pipe, and that's oddly what was used in the project before this happened. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Paul. And yeah, just the whole kind of visual narrative created around, I guess, some of the things that we were trying to do through the AI observatory. It's been fascinating, and also, of course, has a life of its own. And yeah, it's really brilliant. Thank you so much for that. We have some time and a few kind people who stayed back to discuss with us. So I have a few questions, of course, and it would be great to have kind of a discussion amongst ourselves as well. But let me just ask everybody who's watching from afar a little bit if they have any questions specifically to particular contributors or generally about the project. We'd love to hear from you, or even any thoughts. Don't be shy. Or I can kick it off, because I kind of really wanted to hear about coming from this very stodgy, non-creative background of being a lawyer, unfortunately. I'm really interested in kind of hearing from all of you who've like kind of what motivated you in terms of what you think artistic practice can contribute to these technological visions beyond just thinking about like, let's do a design sprint for Facebook and Google and figure out more kind of dark patterns in which data can be collected, or let's make like this closed metaverse of advertising systems around us. So yeah, I mean, for anyone who wants to talk about like what the inspiration was in terms of how do you think like art or speculation can try to start shaping our futures in different ways.
Can I jump in? Yeah, okay. So I am working on I'm doing some work on gender-based violence, online gender-based violence, and also understanding trans identities, not just in India, but in the South Asian region itself. So it's very interesting when I had conversations with trans people in Sri Lanka, or people working on trans rights in Sri Lanka, they were like, they don't have this concept of a third gender identity, for instance, right? Like what we have in our culture of Hijra or Aravani or that sort of a culture. But it's very interesting, fascinating for me. These are all Sri Lankan Tamils, okay? And they're like, they give me a reference of, so they saw someone by name Namita in the Big Boss in Tamil, who's a trans woman, and that's how they understood. And so someone's telling me, a trans person's mother was able to understand what the identity is or their experience only because of seeing this Big Boss in Tamil, which is a Sri Lankan Tamil watching Tamil show from India, right? So this is the role what in media can actually play in reshaping a lot of imagination. And I mean, I come from a communications background. I've been a journalist, I've been a copywriter, marketing professional as well. So for me, my imagination is about how can I tell stories and who I'm speaking to. And I think the power of language and storytelling is so much, and media has such a huge role to play in terms of communicating or even explaining technologies to people, uh, combined with trans realities, at least in my example.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I think from a creator's perspective, what ever so happens is that when you're conducting some sort of design research, you may not always have solutions. You would be boggled by a lot of questions that you can't possibly have answers to. And you also may not have enough resources to sort of create the kind of impact you want to. And stories just by themselves do not work. So creating media, creating art, expanding the narrative to a larger audience is something that really helps you shape an understanding of what you've just done, and then also take it forward from there through those different perspectives. So I think that's what Reclaiming AI Futures really did for our project as well.
Thanks. Diana, you had your hand raised.
Yeah. Thanks. I think that's a really interesting question. I think for me, it's very important to think when I think about artistic interventions, to think in terms of forms and like how it's different from, say, more activisty or even legal or policy kind of forms in which we are making those interventions. And I'm not saying, like, I feel all forms are important, but with an artistic intervention, there is much more of an there's not an end game in some way. So when you look at, I think I want to just like put forward this idea of, on the one hand, a compliance form versus a conversation, and what are the different aesthetics and the possibilities, the affordances, you know, that each form can elicit. And what happens with something like a compliance form is that there's always an end product in sight, which is already defined. And when we are thinking of speculative futures, I think the part of speculation is that we don't know. We don't really know what's coming next or what it could exactly look like. So there is a sort of formlessness in artistic endeavor, but this is that part of formlessness which gives like possibility, which does not already foreclose the politics which would happen in the future or in an alternate form. To get to something really radically different, I feel like we also need to be suspended in that like middle space, right? We can't get to something radically different on the basis of the given politics, the given power relations, the given institutions, which we already have. So I think artistic work kind of like this approach helps, at least like with the game, for instance, it was really helpful to reimagine the kind of conversations which we are having around AI, or what is even possible to talk about, what falls under the rubric of AI even, and to talk about it in a more open space. And I think that's what I would say to your question. Thanks.
Thanks, absolutely. And that's kind of, yeah, what's spurred me calling for these projects as well, like the idea that, you know, why is our imagination so limited? How do we kind of break out of these molds and these inevitabilities of technology? Shrishti?
Oh, yeah, I was just going to quickly add something to what everybody else has said. And for me, this was especially useful to know, but it's just art specifically has been very helpful to me to take away any of the intimidation that surrounds technology and this ambiguity that kind of lets it get away with a lot of what it does, right? So the ability to translate these like heavy terms or industry specific glossary terminology into something that is accessible to a wider audience that isn't actually been introduced to this in a much larger scale is really useful, and actually lets like I guess, the information filter down across societies or across industries, and lets it become a lot more involved in our daily communications, which is where you can actually start then tackling the problems of technology and around AI specifically. So that's why projects like these are important, because you put something like that doesn't really have a form like AI outside of, I guess, computer screens, and give them like different interfaces. You put them in a game, so it's easy to learn. You put it in a poetry or a narrative, so it's easier for people to talk about and discuss. And I think that's really powerful, essentially.
Thank you. Daksha?
Yeah, I would have to absolutely agree with what Srishti said. Art does strip away some of the fear that you have with this, this arena of tech. It's scary if you don't naturally feel very friendly towards it. But art sort of gives you this pool, this warm water you can step in and really explore it without without feeling like there are too many consequences, but there absolutely are. I think one thing that's very important for me that art does for me, or a creative expression does for me, is that even when people react to something, it's not in legal terms, it's not in coded words, it's through art. Even a simple sigh, like I'll say this in Hindi, but भगवान जाने क्या होता है, भगवान जाने इसमें क्या होता है, हाँ? Yeah, even the way, so I'm working with rural schools over here. Sometimes I ask them, what do you think? How does YouTube give you a video? How does it know you want to hear this song? Huh? So they try to sketch out the rationale behind it. Art is important because people respond and talk in art. And when you recognize that, half your things are done, half the stage is set. So that is why being an artist is sort of very intuitive and comfortable, because everyone else is also being that. It's about who puts it down in a tangible format. Yeah, that's all from my side.
Thank you. And I realize this is slightly over time, but there is one question from Amrita. Amrita, can you unmute? Is that all right? I can just voice that for you. It's to the AlgoLeela team, and they're curious to know about the iconography. One would imagine that it's not necessarily representative for gender, for example. And they want to know what kind of considerations you make, or one could make when making such design decisions, even when we speak of AI design. So anyone from the team wants to respond?
Okay, I can take that. Simran, you can keep responding. And as I was talking about it, Amrita, first of all, thank you for your question. And the iconography is actually, it's a parallel that we've drawn. Like all artists, we've also tried to draw a parallel. And since we were trying to look at it from the view of a user who really is like dealing with these systems that's asking them to do certain things in a given span of time, we often heard people looking at this app and going like, Bhagwan jane why this happens. So I'll translate it. This means God knows why this is happening. God only knows why this is happening. God only knows why I am getting a pickup right now and this person isn't. Or why do I have to do this and not him? Or why? So it's actually coming from the conversations of people that that the iconography came about. It's through their conversations, it's through our research that the iconography came about. And yeah, I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but please feel free to.
Yeah. Sorry, I wasn't able to unmute earlier, but I understand. So basically what you're saying is, it came from, you see maybe, delivery workers conglomerating in a section. So because I was just seeing, a certain kind of iconography, I was just curious. So you probably, your field was a certain kind of gig economy because of which from where the icons came about. But for example, when we think about simple design, when we think of design of, let's say, even a simple thing like a report, we want to make the iconography as diverse as possible to the extent that it is kind of relevant to a more expansive audience. So yeah, so that was just a thought that came to me when I looked through some of the slides. Of course, it's very interesting, but that was just a thought that I had, so I thought just check with you. But thank you for your answer.
Thank you, Amrita.
Thank you. And there is another question, but I'm also just cognizant of time, and I know that I've taken a lot of your, we're kind of over time already. But if you want to stay back, and then we can also take those other questions. Pranav, I realize that we're also kind of taking your time, so it's on you. There is one more question.
No, continue. I think this question was from Diane, so we can discuss it.
Absolutely.
I don't think it's a problem.
Great.
Yeah, I just typed it because I wasn't sure if we were like running out of time or what. Yeah. Great. But thanks. I was actually really struck while you guys were presenting Daksha and Simran about like the connections between your, mine, and Vishal's project. So because I mean, part of my inspiration for the work is also to do with like thinking about like spirituality in a way, and like communication with the non-human part of it, and like what kind of divine sort of aspects play in it. But like, of course, my approach, like my inroad into it, was from a different avenue. And I was really struck by how you presented it as a black box, the divine as a black box, which AI kind of lives by. But then again, like there was a very specific representation of the divine, which really spoke to a certain kind of Hindu iconography, and then like that made me think of Vishal's project actually, and the kind of lived experience of caste, which his project exemplifies, and how that might respond to, or how that might interact with even like the kind of iconography of AI as divine. So like I was just kind of just thinking to open up that conversation, and just see what thoughts you guys have.
Absolutely.
Including Michelle.
Absolutely. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, it is true to sort of know that when we use such an iconography, there's a whole bunch of other things that come alongside it. Of course, caste is a huge is a huge arena that comes alongside it, and that was something that how do I say it? It's something that everyone finds inscrutable, much like people find God, much like people find religion, much like people find there's no narrative behind it. Maybe there is some divinity that's going to give answers later. It's all going to make sense in the end. So what we tried to do was to take this common narrative around a superpower, a divine superpower, and sort of juxtapose it against this understanding of AI, that this idea of Leela, that there must be a reason behind it, which we don't get now, which we will get later. It's going to make sense later, and that's something that you will see across. I don't know if I could answer your question, but that's the motive with which we started off with. Yeah, I think Vishal, do you want to go next?
Sure. Thank you, Dhyan, for that. I mean, there's a lot of things, right? It's also about where the works are placed, in what sort of milieu, so to speak. Who's looking at it, who's making the work, where it's being made, why is it being made, things like that, which are more existential questions about the material realities of being Dalit, Bahaujan, or Adivasi in the country, in South Asia in general. So a lot of this kind of conflation that I find problematic, and this is also why a lot of my works don't have explicit kind of representation of any cohesive idea of what it means to be Indian or South Asian, because that doesn't exist, and that is absolutely against the reality on the ground, because such a thing doesn't exist. Like a thing like also using Hindi, even though I myself have made works in Hindi, it's all in service of, it's this idea of that what Silicon Valley does with philanthrocapitalism, right? Is this idea that, oh, like, you know, let's solve the problems that capitalism created by pumping in money towards things that will make us feel good and make this bad feeling go bye-bye. By actually going out and supporting NGOs and things like that. But essentially what you're doing is trying to counter the harms that one system has caused by using the same tools that caused the harm in the first place to then create this additional false narrative that supposedly stands in opposition to what that hegemonic power structure is. So this is also my big problem with protest and revolution and all these terms being used within the context of South Asia, is because who is protesting? Who are these revolutionaries? Simple example is I made a work about this, but like at the end of the day, if somebody asks who's a revolutionary that you know of in the last like maybe 5 years, somebody's going to bring up Kanhaiya's name. Whereas he's not really the person who exemplifies what the ground reality is. So there's all these other things about what signs and signifiers are, like that kind of Hindu iconography, and this attempt to subvert it while remaining to be a part of that system that encourages the use of that iconography, that kind of uses that in order to kind of continually oppress and uphold the myth of caste, right? The upholding of that. So there is no, for me, and I don't mean to be rude about it, but for me, there is no way you can use that iconography to counter anything, because the hegemonic power structure is that. So for me, there is not a way in which that can be subverted if you are already not someone who has that lived reality, who has that lived experience of already having taken some of those symbols. I mean, a lot of the symbols you see today, they come from Buddhism, but it's no longer, you know, there or related to kind of communities that had those histories which are kind of erased. So a lot of it is also like your question is also interesting, because it's, for me, it's like, what is the constitution of a Hindu iconography? What is that actually like? Because it's not we're being told that it's a somewhat linear, sort of clean system where everything is understood and we know what the origins are and what the composition is and of what even constitutes Hinduism, let's say. So even this iconography and the way we think about it or speak about it, a lot of it is that conflation between, eventually, in order to oppose the narrative, we end up using the language that is used to perpetuate that narrative. And that is what I see in, like, with my own works, where I've used Hindi and I've used certain kind of dialect, certain kind of language, certain kind of aesthetics. And I don't really think, for me at least, that actually works, because I think that takes away the power of art to be this effective tool of, this effective basically surface or medium for accessibility. The only way is to really is to go beyond. Like, I think it's also the art, like the whole question. I was like just hearing what everybody was talking about art is that like it's such a silo, right? Because it's so much to do with technology and art and AI, and all of these are like, they're essentially problems of literacy. They're problems like that are in that social sphere. It's in the policy sphere. But who are the people sitting and writing our policies? They're people who have similar education background to me, but completely different caste and class compositions, who are, you know, accomplished or have a particular kind of education in a particular kind of environment that can only go as far as their research takes them. But it can never talk to lived realities because it's not, again, it's not their kind of everyday. So for me, that's the thing. I see somewhat that art is that bridge, but it's also this danger of like trying to, I mean, I've definitely in that trap as well, like trying to kind of make art about things that are relevant culturally, critical discourse-wise, artistic discourse-wise, as well as also at the same time attempting to reflect or even like draw from lived realities, essentially turns it into a super complicated, like, I don't know, like relationships and things that you're complicit in that you don't actually realize that you are complicit in. A simple example is in my own work using GPT-2 or GPT-3 in some of it is just in by the usage of that API itself, I'm already part of that, the problem, right? The supposed problem. So there's all these like, yeah, it's a really complex kind of relationship between all these different sort of interconnected web of I guess problems is the word. But for me, I just personally, I'm going a step ahead and just saying like, I think it's a lot of it is like the speculation is in time in terms of linear time, but linear time is not what holds the answer in some way, particularly because and there's this thing that I'm like building called Spouts futurism, which essentially says like there is no futurism. It can't exist because right now we're not alleviating the problems we have. We're not addressing the material like conditions of now. So who has the luxury of dreaming up futures when you don't have the luxury to maybe kind of see what happens in the next moment or so. So for me, it's that kind of space that I sit in, and I think the myth of caste is particularly interesting because it is super insidious. It is it's interesting in a very kind of perverted way. It's also this thing that kind of it's in all the systems, so it's difficult to talk about it without as in my experience, like without making enemies on either on the institution side, on the policy side, or even within artistic discourse, or worse is to be subject to some strange, really strange forms of violence, online or offline. So yeah, sorry, I just kind of went off on a longer tangent.
No, thanks so much, Vishal. And yeah, I mean, sorry, I was just kind of thinking about like what it means to firstly speak from lived experience and try to embody that in your own work, and how important that kind of positionality is, I suppose. And I'm also trying to learn, at least in my own work, to think about like reflexivity and thinking about where I'm coming from, why I'm writing, what I'm upholding, what even, like, sure, I created something like this because I had the resources. I'm in a position where, I was able to maybe fund this or reach out to people, but really it's in many ways, it is helping me and others kind of uphold these particular systems already in the process as well. So yeah, I mean, it's a difficult process, I guess, of reflecting back on your work and your positions and what it means and how really, I suppose, where can you really come in and critique it and try to dismantle it in ways. Yeah, Diane, you were saying something, sorry.
No, I was just thanking everyone for sharing their positions, I mean, their thoughts actually. And I mean, I could say a lot of things, but I think I'll just take this time to reflect on my own privileges and, of course, which I have also been doing in the making of this book. But I think it's a good moment to like think about the particular positionalities we come from and how that shapes our work. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. And yeah, we're quite a bit over time. I just wanted to thank everyone again. I mean, this is, I suppose, to an extent, a beginning of this project. Hopefully, it's going to be, with everybody's contributions, taken to different places. It's kind of out in the wild now, so I don't really know what the evolution is going to be like. But hopefully, like, it keeps growing, keeps kind of evolving with all of you as a part of it. And thanks for taking this out. We're going to try to put this up, like put the session up, because I think it has a lot of important learnings and of course all of your contributions and discussions about your projects on it. So we'll try to splice some parts of people who didn't want to be recorded and then put the rest up on YouTube. That's fine with you. Yeah, and thank you to CIS as well. Thanks, Pranav, so much for helping organize this. It's always great to, I really miss coming into CIS and actually meeting people, and it would be great to actually, be in a room where we can have these discussions, and maybe sometime in the future, that's a possibility again. But for now, thanks so much and have a great rest of the evening, day, afternoon, wherever you are.
Yeah, thanks, Divij. Thanks everyone else for making it. This was, I'm sure everybody who listened to it learned a lot of things that wouldn't normally be spoken about during sessions like this or events like this. But yeah, thank you. And I'm definitely going to go check out more of your creations in the observatory in more detail now. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much to.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Stuck around as well.
Bye, and thanks to everyone who stayed back till the end.
Yeah, thank you to all of them.
Thank you to the entire panel. Thank you.
Everyone, see you.
Bye-bye.